And this is the Cannabis and Corporate Social Responsibility panel. Welcome. Very much needed conversation. My name is Jen Lujan. I am Director of Social Impact at EASE. For those of you not familiar with EASE, EASE is a technology platform that connects consumers to brands and dispensary partners to have cannabis delivered to you within minutes, and we operate throughout California. I've been working in corporate social responsibility for over 10 years, and prior to EASE, I worked at, or I founded a nonprofit organization that was a compassionate care organization called We for Good, where we delivered free cannabis to terminally ill, low-income patients. So really, my role is really sort of trying to connect businesses and business resources to the public sector and nonprofits to create positive change within our communities. And so while we look at the cannabis industry, we realize that there are so many different issues that need to be addressed and solutions. So it's an industry like no other. You know, we have an industry that is not new. It's just moved into a legal framework. And so what are we doing to address a lot of that transition? And so specifically today, we're going to focus around that on social equity and the social justice component. There obviously is a huge disconnect when we think about, you know, people who have been working in this industry for decades and now transitioning. How are we creating opportunity? What are we doing on the jobs front? Also, you know, there's still some people that are being incarcerated because of cannabis, yet you and I can have it delivered right to us. So there's a huge disconnect and problems and things that need to be addressed on all levels, from a community, state, local level. And today we have an amazing group of panelists who are just really addressing that and really being the models, not just for LA, but as people are really looking at California as a model, it's really getting sort of global attention of the work that's happening right here. So I will let everyone sort of introduce themselves, and if you can just introduce yourself and basically tell us like the work that you're doing specifically in the cannabis community and why you're doing it. So Lauren, if we can go ahead and start with you.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, I'm Lauren Estevez. I'm the head of the business and regulatory practice at Margol & Lawrence Law Firm. I've been in the industry since shortly after Prop 64 passed in California, so I've seen a lot of the changes play out, both in terms of commercial cannabis businesses being able to operate and in terms of the expungements that are now available for people who had prior cannabis convictions. In terms of social equity, I can speak to some of the regulatory frameworks and how the policy is playing out on the ground. I represent operators all over the state in California and also on the East Coast. And some states there, like Massachusetts, are implementing their own social equity programs. I can also speak to some of the business reasons why cannabis companies might consider corporate social responsibility as an important tenet as they build out their businesses.
Hi, I'm Felicia Carbajal. I'm a longtime community organizer and activist in both the LGBTQ movement and the cannabis movement, kind of when they were just one. So 1995 is the first time I actively touched this plant, meaning I was asked at a table, round table, not as big as the tables you're sitting at, by a friend of mine who was in my apartment in Berkeley, who said, "Hey, you're going into the city, right?" "Yeah, I'm going into the city." "Well, can you take this with you?" And I grew up in a Fresno, a fundamentalist Christian home, very, very Chicano, where that bag had a lot of implications, especially from the neighborhood I grew up in. But then that person told me, Kevin has HIV. So for me, it was a no-brainer. So my connection to this plant started because of a specific need. You know, compassion, what we called compassionate cannabis in the 90s. I was very fortunate and privileged to be able to be a part of that time in history. I got to phone bank once. Currently, so I'll fast forward you to what I'm doing today. I have worked with Dr. Alan Frankel, who was on one of the panels earlier today. I helped him in the early development of Generation 1 of low-dose cannabis therapies. I helped run his collective for about 3 years. I transitioned into consulting with a lot of different brands in regards to CBD. In the early 2010 to 2000, probably 12, I started seeing the bigger picture. As an intersectional organizer who had worked on the marriage equality movement, I knew we had to have this bigger, broader conversation about what does compassion look like now. And so in 2017, I started working with Dr. Brandy Cross, a PhD biochemist, and a few other people, because I've also ran an organization called California Cannabis Advocates, where we educated mainstream communities, organizations, and foundations, and then, of course, the industry on how to be socially responsible. Right now, I just wear a lot of hats. I'm organizing a lot of things with with the two of them and Jen in regards to equity in Los Angeles. As somebody who's been impacted by the justice system, I know how crucial this conversation and the foundation that we're setting in particular in Los Angeles, the rest of the world is watching. Globally, they're watching, and countries in South America, they're watching. Jamaica, they're already there, so we have to set that foundation so that children in Jamaica get education. So I'm not going to go on my rant, but that's me.
Hello all, my name is Jake Gilday, and I first want to thank Digital Hollywood and Ease and Jen for creating the space for this conversation to happen. It's a very important conversation for a myriad of reasons, but one of those things is also it gives me space to connect with colleagues like Felicia and Adam, and to connect and find like the spaces we can create together to really effectively tackle what is loosely called a social equity, but essentially is the repair work that's related to the war on drugs that disproportionately impacted communities of color. I want to thank you all for that. My experience with cannabis is very long. I have about 20 years of intimately steeped in cannabis and also youth justice. When I was 14 years old, coming from a pretty volatile domestic setting, unexpectedly losing my father, so going through some trauma that was very unexpected, quickly led to me dropping out of school, which led to me getting arrested for that, called truancy, and then I was put on probation for that, and then I still didn't go to school, and then I was rearrested while truant with cannabis in my pocket, and that was a different charge. This was in Boston, Massachusetts in the mid-90s. There's a nice dating me right there. And I will say that I had a very fortunate circumstance happen to me, kind of myriad of circumstances, including very good legal representation, quite frankly, that largely diverted me from an extensive experience with the criminal justice system. But the relationship between childhood trauma and criminalization, specifically through cannabis, was something that really came to existentially define me as a teenager. I would later go on to study criminology with a focus on youth justice at the University of Toronto. I ended up staying in Canada and participating, if you will, extensively in the medical cannabis market up there. I ended up being one of the initial federally medical cannabis licensed cultivators. I came down here about 10 years ago, and my experience here is being largely with cannabis, but also still with youth justice, and finding the intersectionality of that is really what gets me fired up to tackle my day every day now. I am a program advisor for an organization called Underground Scholars Initiative, which is formerly incarcerated students in the University of California system. and finding the community sort of organizations and spaces that do exist, that have been doing the work that is community repair and uplifting communities of color is something that I feel very passionate about, maintaining those relationships, and rather than recreating the wheel with a generation of cannabis, but plugging into those existing community assets and finding a way for us to come together programmatically, but also to advise and consult with us on what operations can look like as far as more equitable operations, and also uplifting potential entrepreneurship coming from the community of color space. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. Thanks also to Jen and my fellow panelists for being here, especially for this conversation. So my name is Adam Vine. I'm a co-founder of Cage-Free Cannabis and Cage-Free Repair, two partnered organizations that help the cannabis industry and its consumers repair harms of the war on drugs. We do that in a few different ways. We consult with brands in the industry on their corporate social responsibility, on the different ways that they can give back and repair those harms. We started licensing our logo in Washington State to a collaboration between a cultivator and a dispensary there, in which these participants have grown a new strain. We've licensed our logo to it, and all the profits from that strain will go to support a reparative justice project in Seattle. I come to this work from a background in political media production and issue-based advocacy, with a focus on criminal justice reform and drug policy reform. And what that looked like really was working with young people of color, from a youth justice point of view, similar to the one that Jake just mentioned. Here in Los Angeles, what it looked like was working with a series of community-based organizations that provide services like re-entry programming, youth organizing, expungement services, and other forms of repair. And while I was doing that, I was working on legalization campaigns, and specifically Prop 64. And it was pretty clear to me that this industry, which was already creating a lot of revenue and a lot of jobs, had an obligation to be providing revenue and jobs to those same communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. So I started to work with those organizations to workshop this idea of how we could create some mechanisms to do that. And Cage-Free Cannabis and Cage-Free Repair are the ones that we came up with. So that's what brings me here today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you all again.
That's great. I mean, I think a lot of you guys, I mean, you have experience, but it takes a lot to really sort of identify that the work really starts now. You know, we had two bills that just recently were signed by the governor, and which, you know, one addressing social equity programs and the other one on dismissal of records. So, I mean, you guys are doing some fantastic programs around that. Adam, do you want to kind of mention a little bit about the work that you're doing around the expungement and why this is really relevant now after this bill has passed?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about the bill that was signed by the governor, which will provide automatic expungement to low-level cannabis convictions around the state of California. But the other thing I do want to mention is that on Saturday begins the first ever National Expungement Week. And while we can talk about California-specific solutions, and that's so important, especially given the size and the scale of the problems here in California, we are part of a national movement for equity and justice in cannabis. And so National Expungement Week will run from the October 20th to the 27th. There will be events in 9 different states in Washington, D.C., in which people can show up and get convictions expunged or sealed or reclassified, depending on the policy in your state, for free. That's very important. And that's also why this bill that the governor signed is so important, that these things will be provided for free automatically by the state, as they should be. Now, the one thing we have to keep in mind, though, is that it's going to be a 2-year waiting period for people to find out if their convictions have been expunged. It'll be in the summer of 2020 that the process will be completed. So we're going to have to be watchful over these next couple of years to ensure that the state provides the relief that it owes to the people who have been affected by these convictions.
Awesome. Lauren, I know that you have experience in doing expungements. Is there, what's your experience been in terms of a lot of the dismissal? What needs to happen now? I mean, it's great that we have this bill, but there's still a lot of people that know that it's just automatic. There's obviously a lot that goes back into it, and it takes the trust of, people doing these events and also sort of assistance. So if you want to speak on that, and then Felicia and Jake, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yes, so legally you have to file a formal petition with the court to get your record expunged, and normally there's a hearing in front of a judge. So after Prop 64 passed, there was a lot of excitement about expungements, but then we saw that the numbers of people who had filed for an expungement were extremely low. So that's why 1294, the bill that Governor Jerry Brown just signed, is very important because it can help streamline the process. And if you look at San Francisco, actually, the district attorney there is using AI to automatically expunge records, and that's a really innovative, interesting program. The Los Angeles DA has stated that she is not going to implement the same program here. So
we'll see. Given time, we'll see how successful if this can be happen.
Or how well we can organize around that conversation and to pressure her to do what is necessary. So on Monday, we are hosting the first of 4 expungement clinics in the city of Los Angeles. The first one is going to be in the San Fernando Valley. Nazarian was kind enough to allow us to utilize the state building. We're also going to be doing a resume clinic. So that's just an example of what's going on all across the country. If you wanted any information about all of the specific states, you have a family member who lives somewhere else, it's offtherecord.us, and that lets people know all across the country where they can actively participate in an expungement clinic.
So, I mean, that's the first sort of step. People have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs, lost custody battles, employment. It's affected their lives in so many which ways. And now to sort of take corrective measures to that is like a whole nother process, which hopefully we're working on. I think that it's the responsibility of not just our government, but every single one of us in this room to be doing significantly more of like what we can do by either monetary or human capital. So yes, please definitely, I hope you guys can definitely spread the word on National Expungement Week. But now, say it's great, people get their records cleared, and then you have the jobs component of jobs that could be provided within the space, the opportunity for jobs. Jake, I know that you've been doing a significant amount of work on this, and even from the job training aspect, if you want to touch base on your apprenticeship program, and Felicia, if you want to chat a little bit on the work that you're doing with we're helping curriculum and in this space.
Yeah, sure. I do want to quickly say about expungement. It's a vital, component of the justice work required to repair the war on drugs. However, there's a slight reservation I have about how the conversation's really almost stopping at expungement. So I'm glad that we mentioned that. It's just one thing that is a part of a myriad of needs that need to be addressed. And my other concern with expungement is just the manner in which the cannabis industry, so the non-community side, has sort of jumped on that term as a one-stop and be-all as far as where justice work's going to begin and stop. It's highly problematic. I mean, to be frank, expungement is largely not a requirement for cannabis companies to be onboarding those that were impacted, including having charges or being formerly incarcerated. So, expungement's key. I'm glad there's visibility, obviously, around it. I think it's important to understand that outside of National Expungement Week, every week, we could spend every single day, all day, expunging those that have been impacted by mass incarceration, and we we would be grossly short of creating an impact that I think anybody on this panel would love to see. So I just wanted to quickly say that about expungement. As far as job force training and working with populations that were directly impacted, to me, it's not rocket science to figure out how these two things can plug together as far as community and the cannabis industry. The ecosystem that my company has built, so I don't even think I mentioned it, but I'm the community impact director for a cannabis company called Telos Cannabis Group. And about 2 years ago, we came together and sort of looked at the supply chain and in the industry and said that that was really the space that needed to be shored up the most to create, an effective business strategy for us and other companies. So through a series of investments and joint ventures, we built this ecosystem of top-tier operators along the vertical. And now we have this ecosystem that everyone's always seeking out. We need to build a great ecosystem that works and synergizes together. And for me, on the flip side of the community, community organizers are in the business of building ecosystems. They do that by definition. That's all they do, because not a single community activist I've ever met or organizer I've ever met is capable of single-handedly addressing the issue they're looking to mitigate. And thus there's this need to come together, if you will, that is organically and authentically manifested in community work. And so this ecosystem that we have as a company, I'm looking to pair up with the community ecosystem that I already worked with in the reentry space. One of the vehicles I'm looking to do that is with this apprenticeship program, because we have a myriad of operators along the vertical that are top tier and are licensed and operating and have experience and capacity to instruct and pass down. We have a program that's an 8-week program. If you go to or if you talk to me after, I'd be happy to point you to a website that goes into it a little bit more. But essentially, it's an 8-week program that if you're formerly incarcerated or directly impacted by incarceration, you can be a part of the program, sort of choose where you would like to get some experience, whether that's cultivation, retail, whatever. And we pair you up with one of our ecosystem partners and kind of go through that program like that. But I will say that, and I think Felicia will talk about destigmatizing and education a little bit more. That's key, because what I'm noticing is I'll get together with community organizers specifically on the job force training side, and they'll love the idea. They'll love the spirit of the idea, and they'll love the potential resources behind it. But the term cannabis is just such a non-starter stigma-wise for so many of these organizations, understandably so, like organizations that are dealing with addiction and incarceration, and these are the populations that they serve, and largely they were negatively impacted by that word. It is difficult for us to single-handedly, again, like just bring along resources and dump them into the community and say, like, here, come get it, like it's ready to go. There's a lot of work that needs to happen at the basic education and destigmatizing level that's going to help groups like mine be able to just bring resources. But until then, there's sort of a much more complex process happening right now, and thankfully working with people who are actively on those front lines, like Felicia.
So one of the things that Smart Farm Research Group is working on with UFCW 770 is what programming would look like in terms of an educational program within the junior college system starting at LA Trade Tech. So everything very early development, looking at the curriculum, still having these conversations, but it took us a while to get there. When we look at students who've been impacted by the war on drugs the most, who come from communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs, people who were houseless. I mean, I feel as though LA Trade Tech, what is it, 75% of the population has been affected by being houseless at one point or the other. It's important that we build infrastructure in schools like this in particular if we're going to be able to get skilled workers in the cannabis space simultaneously. I mean, I've done a lot of work, like everybody on this panel, in community groups. And when I go into certain communities, my own, when I go in the barrio, I'm like, what are we going to do to train our people so that they can compete and be able to have these conversations and understand what the endocannabinoid system looks like and understands phytocannabinoids and understands all of these things. So it's going to be to heal the wounds from the war on drugs, or this constant splinter that we're talking about when we talk about the conversation of equity in particular. It's like it's so multifaceted. Expungement isn't the greatest, but when we look at it in terms of there are 49,000 rights and responsibilities that people like me don't get to have. Things that legal barriers that are established. So we have to figure out pathways for people to be able to participate in any and all capacities surrounding this conversation. So, and education is always going to be key. Like letting people know that these services are available to them. Letting them know that there's an expiration date on Prop 47. Like if you have some poor person's crime, it expires. Get there soon, because there's an expiration date for how long it'll be free for somebody who's already poor and can't afford it.
Yeah, and it's amazing. You know, one thing that I've experienced is that there are these resources and there's this education, yet, you know, for people who have been negatively impacted, for all of a sudden you have a government or you have organizations that are like, we're here to help. They've sort of they've been taught and conditioned to basically not trust. So, you know, it's super important, and you know, that there's organizations like, and there is the outreach that's really sort of telling these folks like, we're here to help. So, I really respect a lot of the work going into this. So now that the bill has passed in terms of social equity programs, the state has agreed to give, you know, 10 million designated to these programs. And anyone could sort of take this, but this is the big question mark. Is really great that the state has designated these funds. However, we all know that that is basically dust. And that's not really going to, when it's all said and done, it's really not that much. So what would you like to see the cities do with those funds? And why do you think it's really important that outside of the public sector and more of the private sector need to be filling in the gaps?
Me? No, you.
Okay, yeah, so the social equity bill is also a really important one. Like you said, $10 million will come from the state to help the 4 cities in California that have social equity programs to fund those programs, because they're severely underfunded to begin with. $10 million is dust, and it would be dust if LA got $10 million, but you know, we'll probably only get 2.5, maybe 3. So the funding is needed in so many different areas. Obviously, social equity applicants need capital assistance, business and technical assistance, help with compliance long-term, graphic design, video, all the elements that every business needs to start up. They need that plus more. They may have other needs relating to their housing or transportation or other situations that arise from their specific situation. So potentially social equity programs could be funding that a full suite of wraparound services. The current funding levels aren't adequate to do that, but that is where different areas could come in to fill some gaps. So the cannabis industry is an obvious solution. Foundations are another obvious solution. So there's going to have to be some sort of matching program that goes on between the city and state funds, and then the private sector, and then the traditional nonprofit foundation sector as well.
And from a company perspective, this is really a way to destigmatize cannabis. So a lot of the large companies in California, and maybe Canada too, but more California, really want to remove the stigma of cannabis, and here's a great opportunity to do that. You know, you have the war on drugs, now you have this booming industry. Turn it around and create a program that provides technical assistance, training, to prepare entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurship is hard. It's not easy to start a company for anyone. So I think it's really important for companies to step in and do their part.
I know you have something to add, Felicia.
So the dust drop in the bucket is an understatement. We've had this conversation, like a lot of people in the room, in terms of what that equates to. So like imagine everybody in LA getting $4. That's how we have to look at it. Go get your Happy Meal and let me know how happy that makes you. So in terms of, we need it all. We need people to think of this conversation differently than they're currently thinking. Adam and I are part of a bigger group, a national group. It's called Equity First Alliance, and we were having these conversations about like, wow, you know, what happens when groups start getting money? What is that going to look like? So grateful for the $10 million. So don't want it taken away by any means, but it's really just a drop in the bucket in terms of what is really needed. I mean, if we want to look at what happened during phase 2 licensing in the city of Los Angeles, not all of those numbers are provided. We don't know all of those facts, but I would imagine that people who come from the communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs, they'll end up with the short end of the stick in a few years in a lot of different ways. Just because we have a policy in place, we don't have any framework to really support or to make sure that these people are protected simultaneously, and that's just in the business portion. So imagine dividing that $2.5 million. I'm hopeful. I was thinking like 3.3, since they were kind enough to give us that for the community groups that are going to be doing education that is anti-cannabis, or at least education that's a lot more centered around harm reduction. So they're getting more money than us. So I'm gonna remain hopeful that it's 3.3 that the city of Los Angeles, but we've identified at least 10 different categories, if not more, that need funding, in a letter that we are tentatively giving to the mayor of Los Angeles to address these deficiencies, whether that looks like imposing a tax or an additional tax, or figuring out a way to actually have some kind of funding, because, well, $10 million is a Happy Meal.
I would just add to that, you know, anybody here who's managed a budget or administered one understands that just as important. The budget is as important as those who get to administer and make the decisions on how those monies get deployed. You know, we don't live in Sweden, so when we talk about governmental solutions to communities, communities that are impacted by a failure in government to address those needs and to begin with, you know, forgive me if I'm not one of those that's pounding on the door saying that the city and the state need to be the ones that end up sort of accounting and solving and creating solutions that come to define what the work looks like. But that being said, a perfect example, that being said, we need to hold our politicians accountable in the same way we do in every other facet of justice work. And right now I know, maybe some others can speak with more detail on it, but I know that one of the funds that was supposed to be dedicated to youth development, that was supposed to be coming from cannabis revenue in the city of Los Angeles, will end up getting dispersed to city council budgets to make the decision on cops. Yeah, and exactly. Like if you look at the history and the pattern of city council budgets, they're largely steeped in law enforcement. So, you know, what looks like an optical win in front of the LA Times one day, you dig a little deeper and it means LAPD is getting more money. You know, to me, that just speaks to, A, we have to hold our politicians accountable. We have to uplift organizations that take buses to Sacramento every single weekend to hold the state accountable, like Youth Justice Coalition and countless others. But in addition to that, it really speaks to the need for the community and commerce side of this to create its own suite of solutions.
Thanks. Like, of course, I wish we had hours to discuss this. It's such an important topic. So yes, definitely questions, but, before, just want to quickly say, this is something that is extremely important, and I feel that after Prop 64, it started, it's sort of like the thought that's like not really, people aren't really think about it because they're concentrating on their business, getting licensed, being compliant, raising money, like all of these different issues. But I do think that there is a way to really make sure that it is really a priority. And if you are a business, it's using your media platform to talk about it. Media is huge to be able to continue these conversations. If you're in government, making sure that you're having conversations and you're including this group in those conversations. So very quickly, we have a couple people that have questions.
Chonkla time. Well, first of all, they're going to have to wait to go through all of the regular processes with probation or parole. So that in and of itself is going to probably put them at a certain kind of handicap. So you have to look at it like that. I mean, there's going to be a wait period before they can actively consume cannabis, participate in certain things like that while they're on active parole. But having said that, that still means after 2-3 years, depending upon how long that tail you have, I would imagine that gives us enough time to have conversations and try to figure out how to deal with that situation in the future.
I think that the absence of conversation regarding impacted groups, including vets, including women outright, is being one of the more disappointing phenomenon that I personally have witnessed since January 1st. I would say that appreciating and identifying the intersectionalities between the populations that you speak of is something that organically happens on the community side. It's not difficult to find the intersectionality between foster youth, vets, formerly incarcerated. Like, those are facts.
Queer, vets, all of those.
Women of color. So that being said, I think that why the conversation has shifted to where you see it is, unfortunately, the state and the city municipalities have come to define social equity in a certain way, specifically, were you formerly incarcerated, specifically for cannabis? Did you come from this neighborhood that happened to be low income? So part of what needs to happen if we were talking about an industry-wide receptivity to something like the impact of vets and the intersectionality with cannabis, we need to lobby the city, we need to lobby the state. Organizations that advocate for your community need to take that narrative right to them and say this is unacceptable. The intersectionality is appreciated outside of cannabis. Why is it absent in the nascent stages of cannabis right now? So I feel your point. I would say that it's difficult to get other groups to advocate for your population. Everybody's kind of in their own lane right now, but that's where intersectionality is key, and yeah.
I don't care if you go out and expunge Jenkins' record, there is always a way to find out what convictions have been had. Always. And it's right there, it's not in real criminal records, so anyone can go back and look at that stuff. But again, you keep hearing all of this language that this is going to happen, I'm going to do that. It's a feel-good message. And until monies are actually appropriated for things, you keep hearing the promise, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Where is the money? Where is the money? Has it actually been appropriated? How do people access the money? You hear there are grants available. How do you apply for a grant? Who's eligible for that grant? What criteria will be used? There's a lot that's going on, and people have to recognize you've got to stop letting the narrative be framed for you by the people who's responsible for the war on drugs. And this is just the reality of the situation. I know. I was involved in that war on drugs for many years. So the reality of it is stop it. Stop it. Because it's not as it seems. And you will see that it's not.
I hear you.
But on the corporate side, what's a really practical implementation of a program? Just give us a simple example of what we want from our corporate partners and brands in the cannabis space. What do we want them to do? If it's not required, which we know it's currently not, we want to see that happen. Just what can we do? Just a simple example of a program. What does that look like?
Jake, do you want to? Or yeah, Lauren or Jake.
Oh, just very small on those. One idea is you could have a business plan workshop for entrepreneurs who are participating in the social equity program. How do you develop a business plan? What are some of the business readiness skills you're going to need? You're going to need how to know how to navigate a spreadsheet, how to read a profit and loss statement, how to do a pitch meeting with investors, and connecting social equity entrepreneurs with investment capital. Those are just some ideas off the top of my head.
Let's say like a corporate grant, right, or a dispensary. Do you see that as something that they should establish as like an arm of their business to give back?
Yeah, as a corporate social responsibility initiative. So the city's program does not require you to build out those programs. You know, you do get priority in the licensing process if you participate in the social equity program here in LA. But I do think that there's an impetus for these cannabis companies to do more than just the minimum required to get the priority in the licensing process. And there's definitely no shortage of opportunity for ways that they can directly impact these communities that have been affected by the war on drugs.
So I'd start off with no beach cleanups. I'll get super specific. Beach cleanups. If you're not cleaning up your neighborhood already, shame, shame, shame on you. In terms of good programming, helping host and put together these expungement clinics, especially because we're going to be waiting 2 years to see an actual rollout. So figuring out how you can actively participate in things like that. Education and harm reduction, conversations that are more science-based. The list goes on in terms of what brands can do to share information. I think the biggest thing that, to kind of piggyback on what Yvette said, I have a lot of friends who are people of color who do not think that certain people should even be participating in this space. So figuring out what that happy medium looks like for all of us to participate together. I mean, I grew up in church, so I always tell people every week my parents gave 10% of what they earned. So if businesses can do, especially cannabis businesses, can do something that's commiserate with that 10%, then I'll be impressed. But, you know, the days of beach cleanups and I don't even know, those are old, gotta go.
I think we've run over time, but I'm also happy to talk to you about some of the things that I've seen. Oh, yeah, no, so many different things, yeah, that you could be doing, and very much what Lauren said. A lot of offering your resources. I can't tell you how many times even our attorneys are helping equity applicants fill out their application and connecting them to investors, and, you know, I mean, so much of their business practices, and just being sort of those mentors for equity applicants. So thank you. I want to give a round of applause to all these great leaders in this space, and I recommend definitely trying to connect with them to hear more.